Starting this. And here we are. Greetings. Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good good fight. I'm very happy here. My guest this week is Clif High. And, you know, I've been trying to think, Clif, what's the best way to introduce you? I've known about you peripherally for many years. And I've known a little bit about your whole concept of kind of linguistic prediction, and maybe we'll even have a chance to talk about that. But digging into your site, I've seen like you're really into a lot of different very fascinating things, from deep state, UFOs, environment, health, anything having to do with woo. You're a psychonaut, as you have referred to yourself, and I think much more. So I'm so pleased to be able to have you. And your website is halfpasthuman.com. You're very active on Twitter at Clif_High. I looked it all up. Welcome, Clif High.
Thank you very much. Nice to chat with you. Yeah,
it's a pleasure, for real. So you were really nice in agreeing to talk about the following topic, which, because I've listened to a little bit of what you've had to say on this, and I thought, wow, this is quite interesting. So really things relating to UFOs, alien encounters, and the secret space program. I listened to a recent interview that you did a few months ago, and I thought, this is very, very interesting. I'd like a whole bunch of questions lining up in my mind. But even before we do that, do you have like a minute or two? I know lots of people are familiar with your work, but there's always others who haven't. Can you just explain very quickly this thing that really sounds like got you famous, which is this linguistic predictive algorithm that you developed along with another individual? What is that about?
Well, no, I developed it alone. The other individual was he was involved as doing the PR stuff, so I could go and do all the real work. No, it's an algorithm that is, I called it Predictive Linguistics, and it relates to the idea that we're all psychic, and we have to express that psychicness. It leaks out of us. It's just got to come on out. We project it constantly. And one of the first places that it hits us in terms of ease of leaking out is within our linguistics, the choice of words we make. And it makes a lot of sense if you look at it from the idea that and a typical English speaker might have 100,000 words that they have internalized, but usually they're only using less than 25,000 words in any given year, absent specialized lexicon for work. And then within a given week, they may only have a vocabulary of 12 to 15, 1,800 words that are essentially recycled in everyday conversations. Yet within those everyday conversations, they will be moved by something to try and reach for a word that they wouldn't ordinarily use. And it is those particular kinds of words that my algorithm picked up and ran them through this thing I called the emotion reduction engine, and it quantified and qualified these such that I was able to make projections based on time that had been associated with language. Mm-hmm. So some words, for instance, have and this is all done on emotion. Some words have a short-term immediate impact, right? They come on up and just slap you right in the face. Usually that's slang. They're a very high emotional impact and import, but very, very minimal duration, very little propagation. Other words are long-term. They have very little emotional impact, but you just know you're going to be dealing with them forever just because of the nature of them. It's sort of a grinding kind of a thing. And I wrote an algorithm that sorted and sifted all of this, and it was able to make some predictions about some events that did indeed happen. So it was very interesting, and it led to the formation of several other competitors at a corporate level. And I'm quite sure that all of the agencies that deny that they do these kind of things are going to deny that they do these kind of things, and they're actually out doing them. So, yeah.
You know, it's fascinating, and it almost seems like a variation of Jung's collective unconscious idea that there's this, first of all, that there's elements of our mind that are beyond our ordinary consciousness. And furthermore, it seems like, you know, we're tapping into something that's almost like a collective, a collective consciousness. Do you, that make sense to you? Or?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's interesting about that because there are indeed species-wide archetypes that are not cultural. So at that level, Jung was correct. And you see these species-wide archetypes express themselves in people's recounting of ayahuasca journeys, this most recently, right, in terms of the last 10 years or so with the psychedelic tourism down to both Africa and South America.
Yeah.
And you'll see people from all different kinds of cultures, Asian, German, American, Canadian, and all over the place. Go down there and they will have an experience, and they will express within their own culture their cultural view of an archetype that is in exactly similar across everybody else's culture when not expressed in our ordinary cultural paradigms. And so it begs a lot of different questions as to what is the reality that we're living in, and what are we as a species. Doesn't answer any of them, but
No, it's fascinating, and I just could say along my own lines, I've come to a similar series of questioning about what is the nature of this reality, indeed, I guess this is a good segue to go into the UFO subject, actually, because my sense is that this perception or this perspective of yours does inform how, at least in part, how you look at the UFO phenomenon and the idea of alien encounter. It's relevant to say that you've described yourself as a psychonaut. So you've done a great amount of hallucinogenic drugs, at least at one point in your life. You now go into meditation. And am I right in thinking that you have used both of these methods to take your consciousness elsewhere and have experiences with other intelligences? And this is
Correct.
part of your understanding of UFO alien phenomenon.
Yeah, correct. And it materially informs, it constructs the paradigm through which I view reality. And I don't see how it could be otherwise that you could have such an experience. And see, here's the thing. You could easily split people, human beings, regardless of culture, into two groups. Those people for whom culture is their warm and enveloping blanket that allows them to not fear being alone and ultimate demise. Okay, and everything about them is expressed through that culture. And how they think of themselves would not exist without that culture, because they think of themselves as an accountant or a CEO or whatever, or as a driving a particular car, all of these kind of things. Mm-hmm. Then there are those people that, and so for these kind of people, psychedelics are very scary things because it shatters the culture. Then there are those kind of people that are constrained by all of this, right? And they are the ones that are the psychonauts, and they use the psychedelics just for that, to break out of the constraints that culture puts on us. And it's possible to see the world as a result of direct experience in a way that is shockingly more real than our materiality. Okay, so that is one of the first things that informs you that this is not a recreational kind of a media, for instance. It's an actual technology, and that is this sense of more real than real. And once you start really cogitating, even it can take you decades to absorb and integrate all the stuff you learn in these journeys. But even within a few years of one of these journeys, you can really start cogitating on what you felt, how you felt it, and some of the perceptions that were just there, but were not central at that time to your recording mind. You know how you walk along and you record things and so on. With the psychedelic journeys, you can get to the point where you examine the reality of our current environment and everything around us years later, just based on a casual observation that you had in one of those episodes. And so it's those kind of things that led me to my understanding of the universe's energy. Which has turned out to be quite fascinating because it's exactly how other people have seen it. Keeley, Tesla, Feynman, most of modern day quantum physics and so on. And so some of the insights that I've learned in as just in learning to deal with that environment in what we could call hyperspace, that place which is more real than real, but is not here, and insofar as you can tell, is not material the way we are material now. But those kind of journeys and the things you can learn allowed me, in this case anyway, to say, oh yeah, sure, this makes 100% sense on some of these complex formulas that they're rolling out for quantum mechanics, because I've seen it in reaction in terms of, I've seen it in that reality.
I just want to add one thing here, if I may.
Sure.
So I'm not a psychonaut. Not me. So, but on the other hand, I mean, other than experimenting with like low level, weed, things like that. Right. Yes, absolutely. But not actual hallucinogenic or psychedelics. And I say this because I've had this very odd relationship with it, in the sense that I believe you, like that you and other people who've delved into this are onto something, and that there are perceptions there. From my perspective, having not gone down the road of even mushrooms, never even done it, let alone anything even more intense than that. I have to say, there's always a part of me that wonders, all right, so what is the person experiencing? Is it that their chemical nature of their brains modified temporarily, and they're seeing things in a more intense way that can be absolutely valuable for sure? But what's the takeaway from that? Or are they actually breaking on through to the other side and experiencing this other reality? Is there something that the drugs do that open you up to another reality? And I do know that this is a conversation that people have had. Ayahuasca, for example, they ask this among themselves, like, is it a shared reality that we're all getting into, or is it each person in their own little private Idaho? What do you think about that?
I think it's a shared reality, and I think that there's proof for those individuals that are genetically able to relate to psychedelics in a particular way. So let's examine this. The nature of psychedelics can be thought of as having three distinct phases, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The first is the dissolution of the ego and all that implies. The second is the understanding of reality and how the place we're in may not be as real as we think, and all that implies. Then there is the third part of this, which is the self-examination. So a lot of that actually goes into and gets us into where we can have physical proof that these things are indeed, even though they're hallucinogens, they're true. I mean, it's a hallucination, but it's a true hallucination, right? I think Terence McKenna actually called them that because it's a truth that you get out of there, because you can actually have material things occur in this world that are the direct result of something that happened in hyperspace. And so, for instance, my dealing with the linguistics and building that emotional engine and all of this was entirely the result of what I had been instructed about how humans and emotion worked by this being that I talked to in one of the reasonably stable worlds that I visited. Now, you have to understand that not everybody gets to these reasonably stable places, okay? Many people don't travel per se. They spend all of their time in a psychedelic journey involved in themselves, dealing with their own issues and all of the problems they've got. That's why it's such a healing plant, especially like mushrooms, and with Oregon now getting ready to be able to treat PSTD and a great many other conditions with these. We'll see the results of that, right? But that's where, let's just say 90% of all people get to. You have to take shamanic levels to break through to that other side. And here's some hardcore facts. We have a pineal gland, right? And very few people understand how the pineal gland comes into existence, and the fact that we actually have a third eye, which is to say that at the time that the fetus is forming, a part of the palate actually separates up and forms the eyes. In that process, we form our third eye, the pineal gland, which has rods and cones, but yet never sees outside light. I say outside light because it may indeed be receptive to biophotonics.
The pineal gland has rods and cones. I just want to make sure. That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Correct. Our third eye is exactly that. Is from the time of fetal development, it is an eye in every respect, except that it does not have the ocular components to the outside, but it still does have that feed into the visual cortex, among other areas of the brain.
Okay.
It's also one of those glands that is joined by these threads to the vagus nerve. So here we are beings with an eye that can't see outside of our own brain. So that should give anybody with a mind a big, what's going on there and what's that for? And then you'll notice that all of our literature and all of our history for enlightenment experiences begin with flashes of light that are not external. So they're originating within that third eye, and that's the opening process. Unfortunately, in the process of psychedelics, it's also associated with the ego dissolution and the sense of death and all of these other terrible things. And that's why very few people actually take enough to go through that process and survive it with enough of their mentition intact to make benefit out of it. It's famous that you have an incredible psychedelic journey. You get to this other planet, you talk to these incredible beings, and you come back with the staggering knowledge that your nostril is exactly the size of your little finger. I mean, not worth very much, right? So there's categories of psychonauts, and there's those people that deal with it. There's most people that don't want to deal with it. Those people that deal with it, and it's an internal cleansing thing. Those people that can take enough to cross over the threshold, but it so shatters their ability to think that they cannot act rationally on the other side in this hyperspace that we can't see. And then there's the very few of us that end up in this space where we can bring things back. And in my case, I brought back a great deal because I was very greedy. Once I understood and grasped what was happening, I used a great deal of my time there with the idea of acquisition of, let's call it intel in blue chicken cult words. I was out for any kind of information I could get because these were clearly not intelligences that were human.
Well, I would like to ask more about this. So I think this is a great introduction to where I was hoping to go now. This journey that you have been taking, which you feel very strongly is part of a shared experience, and let's accept that for at least the moment. And it could very well be true from where I'm sitting here. Let's say it is. That informs your perspective. And so what... I heard you on one interview, and I almost got the impression, I'm sure this isn't what you meant, that the psychedelically generated experiences were more real than some of the encounters that people were claiming to have had. Like, in other words, people who believe they've had, anyway, abduction experiences or other types of encounters. Clearly not all of those are true. I would certainly agree. But I am of the opinion that probably some of them are true, and I'm guessing you might agree with that. What's your take on what these other intelligences are? You've been out there, you've had encounters. What are these other beings like as far as you have been able to learn?
Well, I need to preface that by saying if we were to compare that against the abduction guys, then one thing that's common with people that have been abducted is this sort of blanking, dampening, smudging or wiping of memories. So they have to be recovered and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That's not the case when you encounter these beings in hyperspace. I have a number of impressions of them, some of which may be valid and wrong, and some may be valid and true. I just don't, it's hard to ascertain what's, until I can actually get my hands on one of them and compare with what I think I know. It's going to be hard to validate that. But so, one of the things that I do think is valid is the abductees saying that the grays, the reptiles, and so on are, for lack of a better word, robots, biological robots, okay, that are grown by the actual controllers. I believe that to be the case. I believe that to be the case because of perceptions that are emotionally backed and based, but not entirely limited to that. So there's for instance yogic training that can teach you to find these specific cardinal point rods and cones in your eyes that are the joining boundary between regular perception and peripheral perception. You can use your this is one of the ways of controlling your parasympathetic nervous system, the same way you use breathing exercises or staring at a candle. Well, this is what you can do with it here in this material, in this material. But you can use those same points in your hyperspace eyes, and you see vibrations at a different level. So you could see, for instance, a mantid-like being, and you could see a tone that defined that mantid being's personality, and you could see that tone being expressed in these offshoot creatures that are around it. And when that mantid being gave commands, these other beings would scatter off and do it. And it is as though they all felt the same. And so I could identify all of those as being basically, its minions and drones. So there's a different level of perception because it's not limited to our five senses. You have the ability to perceive vibrations at a different level, and those vibrations have flavor, something very complex, a lot of nuance, and so on. But that's how I know, for instance, that those encounters I've had in hyperspace, whenever I encountered a being, that I was able to discern that this being was not human.
Okay.
Now, you can also see in hyperspace, you can see a lot of those I suspect that a lot of those beings that I saw that were just able to maintain themselves as spheres, erratic or otherwise, a lot of those I think were fellow humans that were also engaging in psychedelic experiences at that same time, had also broken through to hyperspace, but that was the best they could do.
Yeah, I heard you describe this before. I thought it was very interesting. So when you're out there, there's this whole community and all these other entities that are there, and some of them are just like you, as it were, other people who are out there having their experience. And then there's other entities who've been there maybe a long time, maybe not a long time. I found that quite interesting, and I'm glad you're mentioning it here. One thing I would add, excuse me, is your assessment of the greys and of the reptoids, or the reptilians, and of the mantids is very much in line from what Dr. David Jacobs has assessed from a completely different way of looking at it. You know, he's gone, pardon me, he's interviewed people, done regression of individuals who've had what he believes are abduction experiences. And this is his conclusion, that the mantids are running the show, that they do not have emotions in any of the ways that we human beings do. They don't operate that way. They don't have compassion. They don't even have art. They don't have the kind of creativity that we human beings express. And similarly, that the greys, whether the tall greys, the short greys, that they are created species and designed for just fulfilling a specific role, limited to zero emotional capability, but high intellect cognitive capability. And this is, I think, what you're getting from your perspective as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's so I ran into this other fellow that we can, call Fred. He was a hominid, a humanoid from some other place that had a body that was not like our bodies in a number of ways. A very muscular kind of guy in a very broad, flat head, very heavy plate kind of thing. Anyway, but he'd had encounters, or his species had encounters with the bugs, was familiar with them. And that was their assessment as well, was that the bugs are exactly as you described. They don't operate on emotion. And so this is something we cannot fathom, okay? Because throughout our entire material world, from earthworms, amoebas, and on up, we have some ability to interact with a being. So we could cause an earthworm to do something by causing it an irritation, that in essence is going to cause it a hormonal response that causes that earthworm to get away from being poked with a pin or something, right? The bugs don't have that, even at that level. So they're really strange beings. The closer you get to humans, you have more of a vagus nervous system. You're more sympathetic with us. We get more of an emotional interaction with you. More of our communication is nonverbal and so on. And the bugs are entirely different from this. They're telepathic, and so they have no facial expression. Their face does not change no matter what what kind of
Well, why would it? Because we
exactly.
use our face to communicate our emotions and all these different things. And if we're going all telepathically, we really don't need facial
Why
expression.
waste the energy, right?
Yeah.
And they have no clothing, they have no accessories. The one guy wears a robe, and I think it's more of a like a lab coat.
I want to stop you right there. So if
Sure.
there's an entity that's wearing a robe, I've often wondered who's making the clothes. Do they have a manufacturing infrastructure? Seriously, that makes robes. How is this person wearing a robe?
It's wearing a robe because it can generate it. Okay, so this is in hyperspace. So I don't know what the bug does in non-hyperspace material world. I don't know how it presents itself. But within hyperspace, there was one of them that wore this really shabby kind of a robe, and it's created on your mind. So when you first pop through the barrier, when you first come out of the dissolution of your body and you've passed through the death barrier as a result of the psychedelic, which part of the process, by the way, is that especially with mushrooms, it's constantly pulling you back and forth. So it allows you to get so far, and then you've got to go through that dissolution part again. So this is like a 6 or 7 hour journey, and you'll repeatedly have to go through some of the more distressing parts. But nonetheless, when you get there, you're a sphere, because that's the most efficient form that anything can be contained in this materium, and apparently as well in hyperspace. Now, I had to be taught first to communicate with the guy with the thick head, flattened head, and then I had to be taught to extrude my body so that I could sort of look like I looked here on Earth. A very complicated process that involves several hours worth of learning this, but thereafter it was easy to repeat on subsequent journeys because you could just pop it into existence, because it was like, oh yes, how rude of me, and you extrude your body. I don't know that the bugs operated that way, because their level of body extrusion, so to speak, was not like myself and like the guy I was talking to, because we're always constantly with your mind trying to keep yourself together for the conversation, trying to hold your body in some kind of condition of reality, and at the same time trying not to be distracted by the 55,000 other beings that are in that same space with you, that are flashing lights and making noises and whipping around and doing all this strange activity.
I want to ask you about those in a minute, by the way.
Yeah, it's very, very chaotic. So yeah.
Right. Well, let me ask now. So there are other types of beings that you have encountered. Presumably, I mean, some are from here, some are human, but some are not human. So have you, and you mentioned the blue chicken cult, and I would like to key in on that in a moment as well. I want to get your sense of what these other beings are like. So we talked about the mantins and the greys, and a little bit about the reptilians. And I think we agree, like, their emotional range is not what, at least from what we can see, what a human being would have. But are there other alien or extraterrestrial species that you have encountered that you believe exist that have the kind of emotional range that some people want? I mean, we hear this all the time. People talk about having telepathic downloads from the Galactic Federation or Space Brothers, and from beneficent. Yeah, well, no, I'm saying because I really want to know, like, from good ETs who want to help humans, whether it's ascend to the next density. Got a lot out on the coast that you're on, out on the West Coast, but it's everywhere. Or if that's not the case, are there other ETs that actually you would say, yeah, these are good guys and they really are worth our time to get to know? What do you think?
Certainly with the latter. Okay, there are other beings out there that make sense for us to get to know. You have to understand that there isn't anything you can do to introduce yourself to somebody out there that doesn't want to talk with you or is incapable of handling the conversation. There's also apparently a level of intelligence within what I call the construct. Okay, whatever it is that keeps hyperspace stable has it has like little critters in it, little, like, we might think of as non-player characters. Okay, a new metaphor didn't exist at the time I was having my journeys here, but it fits.
That's become a very big meme in the last 6 to 10 months.
Yeah, right. And actually, Terence McKenna called them the Machine Elves. All right, and I think of them that way as well. And I've had encounters with those, and it's really kind of spooky. the machine elves do things for the construct. And so in one particular journey, I had a very particular goal. I was going to go to a very particular part of hyperspace. And along the way, I come across this very ramshackle, leaning on its side, old broken wood shelf that's just precariously pitched over at this weird angle, on which are all these little 2-foot high dolls. These dolls are what we might think of as like gnomes, okay, in terms of how they look. And I actually have in my possessions now, I'd have to dig for it, but I have a number of faces that I created I was a sculptor that I created of these various creatures that I'd seen in hyperspace. And I created them and cast them in high vitreous ceramic and glazed them and stuff in the 70s and 80s as a result of having recently dealt with these guys. And one of them clearly has the gnome hat and the whole deal. So these machine elves, though, they're there to give you instructions. Now,
wait, you met a creature that had the hat like a classic gnome?
Sure. Well, all of these little critters had that. As I'm approaching this thing to do my business,
that was widely reported, for many centuries.
Sure, and I can even tell you why that was the case and what happened and this sort of a thing. Okay, we can even get into that. It has to do with German beer.
Come on, really?
Seriously. Okay, as a slight. All right, let me finish with this guy, and then we'll go into the German beer. Okay, so there's one of the guys hops off of this shelf and runs on up to me and says, "You shouldn't go there." I mean, just this incredibly big eyes, and he's stabbing his finger and telling me, "You shouldn't go there." Now, he was right, okay, but I discovered something about myself that told me that I was not in an environment entirely my own head, because I became something other than what I am here. I was extremely arrogant and extremely commanding in a way that I'm not normally here unless you aggressively attack me. By here, I mean the materium. When I was there and this guy confronted me, I looked at him and said, "Thank you to stop me, little man," in a huge voice. And then I blew him away with my mind. Literally, I was so offended by this little thing, this little machine elf. So I'd had some contact with him in the past, or with them in previous lives or something, such that I knew that this would work. And I just let out this blast and blew him back up on the shelf. Now, it's true that where I went, I shouldn't have gone, and a lot of other issues there. Okay, and so the machine elf was doing its job, but it was entirely part of the construct. It has intelligence, it has the ability to respond within certain set parameters, but it no more took account of, but it actually responded to my emotional attitude of arrogance and command authority. And I knew this to be its trigger, that I could do that, and because it was a construct, a machine, it would respond and do as I commanded thereafter. So it's like I knew the code. How I knew it, one could speculate on any number of routes. But anyway, so getting back to the other gnomes throughout history and so on, right? Not many people know this, but it was a recent law in the late 1400s, I think 1484 or something like that, where the collective German states, as well as Austria, most of Central Europe, banned the production of psychedelic beer.
Oh.
Up until that period of time, from the late 600s, so for for nearly a 1,000-year period of time, Central Europe made beer with psychedelic mushrooms.
That's fascinating.
And thus all of the reports of meeting the machine elves, the trolls, and et cetera, right?
Well, there actually were. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned this. I had no idea that was the case. Sightings of gnomes, elves, even leprechaun type figures described in all of those really go through the 19th century and even into the 20th century. And I was just recently going through some of those early reports, and I was surprised actually at how many there were. So I don't know if they're all having to do with psychedelic mushrooms.
See, here's the thing: the elves part. I have a tendency to think that the elves are also constructs of the mantids. All right. So the way in my framework, they're presenting us with grays and tall grays and reptiles, less reptiles now, but mainly the grays. But in the past ages, they presented us with the leprechauns and the elves. Now, the whole gnome thing in Germany has these other weird subtexts where it was part of a battle between the local indigenous populations in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, against the Mantids, I believe, in a period of great number of abductions. And these abductions were recorded in the only way that they could be recorded then, which was by the clerisy and the witches, but they burned all of the witches' documents and sorcerers' documents, etc. And then when the church insisted, it was the collective patriarchy of the Catholic Church that insisted that the subjugated German states all ban psychedelic beer. The next thing that happened was there were still battles at that point. Okay, so the people discovered that through the psychedelic beer, they could have power against the abductions. Whether they could get them to stop through psychic ability, or whether they could enlist allies or study the hyperspace constructs. I don't know what the mechanism was. I have some speculations, but I've never really delved into it. But I do know that it was coincident with the rise of, or the reduction of abductions with the rise of the psychedelic beers spreading throughout Central Europe. Then in the late 1400s, the rise of the Catholic Church with its power from the gold and everything had started to accumulate from conquest as well as from the Americas. It had power to subjugate these states and insist on laws, and it insisted on the elimination of psychedelics from beers. And so the Germans passed a law saying, "Thou shalt not make beer out of mushrooms."
Okay, so you're saying that psychedelics are a kind of guard against abductions? Am I getting that right?
They may be a technology that can be used that way if one had some thought to that, because they give you a different range of power, and they also, okay, so look at it this way. The reported, according to Jacobs, according to the people who write about it in Europe as well as Africa, lesser extent there, but also in Asia and Latin America, the reported central theme of abductions is the loss of ability of willpower, that you are not in control of yourself. And then there's all the other stuff floating you through walls and so on. But the real key to this is that they entrain your mind and seize control of the ability of your mind to control your body and your mind to control itself. Well, psychedelic drugs, especially mushrooms and mescaline, caused entirely different neural pathways to exist. They put strength in some and diminish those in others, which is exactly why the power structures don't want you taking it, because the part that gets diminished is your respect for their authority, because you don't believe in their paradigm anymore. You've stepped outside their cult or culture in this sense. And so you're an iconoclast and an outsider. But you also have power because you've got a much stiffened resolve. Having survived death repeatedly this way, you get pretty hardy, and you get an entirely different neural pathway. So it could be that indeed the psychedelic beers that were common for hundreds of years and were relied upon on a nightly kind of a tonic. Now, we're not talking shamanic level doses or anything, right? We're talking micro doses, basically, within the alcoholic beer. And the beer is more of a gruel anyway, not the refined kind of stuff that we're looking at. But anyway, and so, yeah, I believe that technology of the psychedelic ingestion may have been part of the waning of the abduction things, that the reports of which drop off after about 1000. Okay, so from 800 to 1000 AD, they were pretty consistent. And then they dropped off, and coinciding with the grand solar minimum, they dropped to virtually nothing. But at that
I love what you're saying here. I mean, I would want to get more data personally to be comfortable with it. But honestly, I love the theory behind what you're saying. The only information that I've had on ancient abductions or ancient UFO sightings, there's really a couple of sources that were put together by a bunch of chroniclers from through those eras. Jacques Vallée and Chris Aubeck recently put together Wonders in the Sky, which is a nice collection of ancient UFO sightings. And a researcher named Albert Rosales put together a number of books on ancient encounters that have been recorded. I'm not aware of a lot of other sources on this, but
Oh, it's filled. The Celtic literature is filled with it. You just can't look for anything up in the sky, because for their view of the abductions, they were always taken into whirlwinds or glens or mists.
okay.
So it was basically the mental fog that took you. And you'll see repeated references into so and so is abducted and has to be exorcised because she's been demon possessed, right? And they say that the local clerisy reported that she was seen floating through the mist, that kind of thing. So we have and the Celtic literature is just filled with the subtext of the battles that go on as a result of the abductions, the good versus evil things. Well, there's, in my mind, from a human standpoint, from an emotional being standpoint, there is no better definition of evil than that which acts without emotion.
Okay. Maybe.
And so callous indifference, right?
That's a psychopath. I mean, a psychopath,
Correct.
how we understand that. So we got about 15 minutes, if you can believe
Sure.
it, maybe a little bit more. Can we move to the modern era here of UFOs? I'm
Sure.
very curious what you think about this. In terms of, are there encounters that don't exist in the hyperspace? I mean, I think that there are. I wonder what you think about this. I got into the UFO phenomenon about 25 years ago because I started studying UFO reports, military encounters, civilian encounters, just by ordinary people. I mean, things that seem to be happening right on the ground here on planet Earth. People were having encounters with unknown objects and unknown beings. Didn't seem to be happening in hyperspace or in another dimension, or however we can conceptualize that, but right here. What are your thoughts about this?
Sure. I see the buggers all the time.
Yeah.
With the night vision goggles.
Yes, I saw you brought those out once. I had a couple of night vision experiences, and they blew my mind.
Yeah.
Blew my mind. And I guess you've seen a lot out there. You've seen evidence of a secret space program, I think you've said.
And I've seen one instance where I was quite convinced that what I was looking at was not designed by a human, that it was alien technology. And that was this weird, create a sphere or a plate of light and jump into the light and then appear halfway across the sky and do it again, spaceship, this little bloop, bloop, bloop kind of thing. But we also know that indeed there's objects that we've all collectively had experiences with. The Oumuamua, or that came by here that did the slingshot around the planet. This is the mathematics of that are pretty clear now. That was intelligently controlled in order to get that trajectory, and it changed its rate of acceleration.
Oh, the recent satellite that, or whatever this object was, this elongated object that came in to pass Earth around the sun, I believe.
Right, and it's known. It was highly metallic. Yet you'll notice they painted it as a rock for all of the artistic.
Right. All anyone ever saw is that artistic
Right.
Actual image.
So it may have just been, a giant metal spaceship, and we'll never know. But I'm quite convinced that there are indeed material encounters, and I'm also quite convinced that Jacobs is onto something, and that there's millions of abductions, because you see a lot more discussion about it in Spanish and Portuguese out of South America. And it's very much as he describes. It's the same kind of language. The piggyback copycat factor, even if you were to reduce it by half, just eliminate half of all the verbiage and all the instances being posted as being garbage, then you're still left wondering, okay, there's probably 2 million out of Latin America alone.
I keep wondering, though, if Jacobs is missing something. I have great respect for him. I just chatted with him recently, and I like him personally, and I respect his work. But I just keep wondering, is there something he's missing? For example, his opinion on this is that the abduction phenomenon, as we understand it, is not an ancient thing. It's really maybe 19th century.
He says 1890. I don't agree.
Yeah, I don't think that I do either. So, I mean, I asked, what do you think about the ancient alien phenomenon? His answer was basically, it's either it may have existed, but it's not relevant to what's going on today. And I thought, I'm not really sure.
That part, okay, but that part he may be more correct on, because we really do need to get a handle on the millions of abductions that are going on at the moment, and so getting diverted into trying to form it into a huge paradigm where you've got the framework and then we can slot it in. Personally, I'd want to get the details about the thing and we'll build the framework around it.
I agree. We need to get a handle on it because it is very important. But it just seems that there's another element going on here that seems to be important, and you seem to have a take on that.
Well, my particular approach to this too is that I don't buy his conclusions, okay, and his emotional responses to the conclusions. I don't think that the bugs are going to win, regardless of what their goal is. And I think they're
why?
Okay, he presupposes that they're a million years ahead of us. Let's just say that that they've been around a million years longer.
Mm-hmm.
These beings are not as we are. Okay, so there's no reason for us to suppose that they're a million years more advanced than us simply because they've been around longer, because they may not learn the way we do. And in fact, my encounters with them would suggest that that's exactly the case, that these bugs don't learn that way. They learn by steady absorption. And the part of the species that that the mantids go through, part of their issues is that they have these genetic purges frequently. And so the species as a whole erupts into giant battles throughout space-time, killing each other to try and eliminate deviant genes. And so it's the winner that determines what is the dominant gene and how, the percentage and so on. But their society is not so advanced that it is without strife. And that strife that they go through is not as a result of internal personal emotion, but is as a result of a species-wide biochemical triggering of this weird purge where they've got to go and kill others of their species that have genes that are not like theirs.
That's a new idea for me, and I got to really think about that. But I will agree with something here, which is that human society, when you think about how we are on this progress, kind of this exponential progress in terms of our technology and science, only since we've really discovered the keys to the kingdom in terms of science, the scientific method, give it 300-400 years, we have just been leaping over ourselves on this kind of progression that, and that also includes, future artificial intelligence. And years ago, I thought, well, if we're about to develop the singularity in terms of AI and runaway intelligence, they must have also. But I've recently been thinking, maybe not. Maybe our form of computer science is unique, and our form of artificial intelligence would be unique, a unique expression of our mind and our species. And it could very well be, if you give us enough time, superior to that of other species.
Okay, I believe that. And the reason that I believe that is because of Richard Feynman, the physicist, right? Okay, he defines science as the belief in the ignorance of the experts. So we let that
ignorance of the experts. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So I define science, as does he. That bastard over there is wrong. So I'm going to set out a whole series of experiments to prove that he's wrong, because he's taking us down a road that is not valid. Okay. And so our science is basically contention with other people's presumed ignorance on all of our part, right?
Yeah.
The only reason you get motivated is basically to prove yourself right or to prove the other fellow wrong.
Exactly. So it causes a kind of this competition where it's just like,
right.
Greater.
Sure. And the Japanese say that, as steel is tested by steel, man is tested by man. Okay. The bugs are not like that. Aliens are not necessarily like that. And think of what it would be like to be a telepathic species where the telepathy was beamed from mind to mind. That would mean that there would be no belief in the ignorance of experts, because if an expert beamed that into your mind, you would have an assumption that he did, that he was 100% right. So there would not be this continual challenging of stuff constantly. And in my experience with the senior bug that I met, or the first encounter I had with them, they are nonplussed if things don't instantly happen the way they presume that they're happening, and they sit back and they have to cogitate on that non-happening for a long time to try and integrate what it was that they just experienced, unlike us guys.
Can you imagine other extraterrestrial species that are more like the way we are, that have a kind of competitive infrastructure with each other, I mean, when you really, you talk to other people who've had encounters or alleged encounters, you realize like none of the other civilizations are like ours. Like I find that like none have a capitalistic economic type of a system. None use money. None have an infrastructure where they're building and they use initiative and they do things. And I always find like these people who say, "Oh, it's so wonderful." Everyone's big, like they're all brothers and sisters, and I'm like,
Utopia.
"You're really not free." Yeah, I don't really
Yeah.
think that I buy that. I find that very non-credible. But do you imagine, or do you have any ideas whether you think there are other extraterrestrial species that are like us that actually have a kind of competitive nature?
Everyone that I met in hyperspace, other than the bugs and their minions, was exactly like us. And I don't see it as competitive. I define it as transactional.
Okay.
Okay, because
All right.
they weren't there to compete. They were, in fact, there to cooperate, but they were there to
Sure.
cooperate and get ideas that they would not have otherwise or normally have. And it was a transaction, and that you could get an idea for trading an idea to them.
And maybe
And
transactional is a better word than
yeah,
competitive. That might be,
yeah.
be the
Now,
case.
in our case, we have transactional with contention. So we have a hard edge that gets to the matter real quick
Yeah.
because of all of our egos and all of the emotional and so on. But I have met like the flat-headed guy. He was, they're an emotional being. They have, they're hominids, very much bulky like us, and they have a vagus nervous system. And he told me all about the vagus nervous system, how it integrates with our emotions, how it is the key to our emotions and consciousness, how the bugs don't have it, how you can look at beings as having it or not having it, and the degree that they have it will tell you the degree to which you're going to be able to communicate with them. Because see here, bear in mind, we know that the alien abductions are an invasion. Okay, they're doing malicious things to us, even if they're returning the people to their houses after using them for a night. Okay, we know this because the beings that are doing this are not attempting to communicate. They're not attempting to teach the humans that they're involved with a language for any kind of a transaction. Nothing. They're entirely giving orders. So all we can think of, what we must assume, is that we're being invaded by these bugs. Now, these bugs have done this repeatedly throughout all of our galaxy, at least. And the fellow I was talking to, the flat-headed fellow, knew of these beings. But the very first thing, my very first encounter with him was instructions. He gave me enough instructions so that we could then start to transact. The issue with the bugs, the very first thing he tried to do was to blast me out of that area the same way I did with the little machine elf, right? And
you didn't do a big eye roll and say, "Oh, those guys."
It wasn't like that. It was very much not irritated, and that's the weird part. If it were a human, they would just fly into a rage and get irritated and try and throw you out, right? But this guy just tried to give me a very cold bum's rush out of hyperspace using a certain amount of power. And when I didn't go, he gave up on it because he wasn't willing to use the rest of his power to try and force the issue. And so I hung around and watched what he did, not that it was meaningful to me. But no, I'm quite convinced that there is a separation throughout reality, throughout consciousness, and all the forms it takes, and that separation includes beings like ourselves that are transactional in nature, and that transactional aspect of it has contracts and all of this kind of thing, and could have bad effects if you blow the contract. But basically, all of those beings are attempting to get understanding and mutual frameworks in place for transacting. Whereas the other ones, the minority, the bugs and their minions, are all about exercising some power for some kind of a weird sort of a thing. Now, the guy that I was talking to that had the flat head, they were telepathic, but they were telepathic in a more advanced stage than us, but not like the bugs. They were not telepathic in the sense of sending imagery or thought across. They were telepathic in sending you an exact understanding at a nuance level we could not imagine of emotion. And that was because their emotion presented itself as all these shimmering colors that hovered about an inch over their skins. Even in his expressed form in hyperspace, that was an integral component of this guy. And so it was expressing out there. Even as I had a beard in hyperspace, there was no need for me to express that, but I did. Now, those guys, the shimmering beings, they didn't have money and that kind of stuff on their society the way we do, but they nonetheless had cooperation and transactions continuously. And they communicated the vast majority of it through the expression of emotive states through their bodies. And they had art. And he tried to tell me at one time, and it was going to try and give me an idea, and it just didn't take. I just couldn't bring it back.
I wonder what the nature of their art would.
Exactly.
What is this creation? Well, you know, every species might have a way of expressing it. And if they're working purely telepathically, there could be a kind of intellectual art or even emotional art that they're creating. Who knows? I don't know how that would work. I'd be interested to know. So we're almost out of time for this segment. And by the way, I'm very grateful you're going to be able to stick around for the Richard Dolan members. We're going to do a quick like 30, 45-minute chat, and I'm looking forward to that. But while we're here, may I just ask you, so because you made me laugh. I listened to another interview you did, and you were talking about the whole blue chicken. What are your thoughts about a secret space program for real? Like, we've got like 3 minutes here, Cliff, but
sure, it's 100% for real. I've seen the ships. I've seen a couple of different configurations of them. They're not like the blue chickens describe. They're none of the I forget who they said had designed it. The fellow that passed recently. It's not like that at all.
Oh, William Tompkins, I believe.
Tompkins, exactly. So there's all kinds of hyperbole and intellectual theft from the blue chicken cult around this idea. But the secret space program exists, and we know that there has been money stolen to support it. And I would also like to argue that at this point, we should examine the idea that perhaps some of that money that's missing is going to a very great effort on the part of our military to identify, tag, and track abductees and hybrids.
Oh man, we could have been talking about this for the last hour because this is such a big thing. I fully agree with that. And in fact, look, there's a study going on right now, kind of quiet, but it's somewhat out in the open, to identify genetic markers of people who have had experiences. And you just got to think. Particularly with this newly, at least for me, science of epigenetics, whereby we understand at least how external influences affect our actual genes, our DNA,
Sure.
That it should, at least in theory, be possible to find genetic markers on people who've had these types of experiences. And if that's so, I mean, my God, everything can open up in terms of tracking population of experiences and then tracking. What if there's a bunch of people who look just like us, but they're not like us?
And then then you might need a huge effort to create vastly expensive machines that no one wanted to have anything to do with, and to try and force as many people as possible through these machines to see which ones are your hybrids and which ones are humans. And you might have to call these machines TSA scanners.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I keep wondering, those naked body scanners that they force people to go through. If they're not currently, they could at any time be covertly equipped with all types of detection capabilities, and they wouldn't necessarily.
Well, here's the thing. 5G, as we understand it, did not evolve from the telephony industry the way that Wi-Fi or radar basically did. 5G evolved from laboratories where it was used in DNA analysis and DNA splitting. That's what 5G comes from, is to be able to, the type of rays that those things are, it penetrates very shallowly, but in such a huge bandwidth that it can bring back in a really good picture about your DNA. And so 5G microscopes are used in DNA research and have been. The machines that we see for the full body scanners is a up leveling of that to a huge level. And
can we go a little longer? I just want to go a little faster because this is just too good. And I think if we ended this now prematurely, I'll just get a whole bunch of angry people.
Right. Yeah, we don't want them pissed at you.
Let's just go. Yeah, because I wanted, there's certain things I still want to follow up with you, but I really want to get into this. So can we, because 5G is an interest of mine, and I've been very, very intrigued by this. I have a friend who has his own, he's spent a lot of time trying to understand this, and he's convinced that it's very, very harmful to us physiologically. I tend to agree with that. There's a whole bunch of other things that we can be afraid of with 5G. The fact that it's informing the entire Internet of Things, which will cause not just your toaster to talk to your refrigerator, but to your TV, to your anything else.
To report to central command, yeah.
Total surveillance. Every aspect. My God. And it's just being foisted on us. It's just happening. Like, I don't even know if there's a way to stop this, but definitely we're moving into a completely different civilization, unrecognizable than anything that existed even like 20 years ago. It's just
and it may be forced on us, because imagine the situation if it's gotten out of hand. We could just take one narrow aspect of this, one little conspiracy theory. So there's aliens. They're abducting us. They're running a breeding program. They're making hybrid humans. They've gotten their production quality hybrid humans close enough to reality to insert into our population. Mm-hmm. They've done it in sufficient numbers. Militaries around the world have become aware of this and are freaking out over this surreptitious alien invasion of, quasi-pod people, and they want some way to track it all. And one way they think they may be able to do so is with these 5G waves, because they may indeed be able to ascertain that the DNA structure on that being is not the same as the rest of the people on the planet, that this is not a native. And the 5G makes sense that way. Now, so they actually find that 5G is interesting because it's got huge bandwidth, very high frequency, huge bandwidth, doesn't travel very far. So you need thousands of 5G repeaters everywhere, which curiously, of course, gives you the ability to triangulate down to the gnat's ass, right? You can tell which way that ass is facing.
Right.
Unlike cell towers, which the best they'll do is to get you within a big-ish grid.
Yeah, people should understand these new 5G towers that they're putting up. Many places now, they're trying to make them look like trees. You've seen this?
Oh, they're way beyond that. They're sticking them in light standards now. So if you've got street lights out there, they can actually put a 5G mini tower, so to speak, a receiver and a repeater inside with the light bulb.
Oh, so they don't all need to be massively tall.
No, none of these. 5G is the other way. 5G is going to be small. It's going to be put up on the corner of every building, all facing corners on all buildings in every city.
So those big tree-like, the towers that are made to look like trees, those are not necessarily 5G repeaters?
No, they may have a 5G repeater on them, but it's very unlikely because 5G doesn't travel very far. So with 5G, the goal is going to be to have a repeater like within every 20 feet. Okay, so you're going to have to have.
Oh my God, that's way too much. I mean,
correct. And the bandwidth levels are fantastic from a computer perspective of getting information out there, but the saturation level of all the people around there with the 5G rays, it's, I've got this friend of mine who's a scientist and has a lab and the whole thing. This is Ken at C60 Purple Power, and he's of the opinion that 5G will spread out right up to the point that we get the very first serious mass lawsuit, where we have potentially 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people in one 5G area that develop all the same kind of skin cancer within a short period of time.
Bleeding out of their ears or some horrible thing like this.
Well, here's the thing. There's two aspects of this we have to consider, okay? One of them is very much more subtle than might appear, and that is we can just say it and then dismiss it. 5G alters DNA. It does so for bacteria and amoebas and viruses. So are we going to be in a new stew of things we don't have immunity for because they're going to be mutating constantly? Okay. So we can just let that one go. That's a valid concern, but we can just let it go. The other one is that it may be the ultimate epigenetic trigger. So the expectation is, all right, so I've had cancer. I've got cancer cells in my body as a result of this large cancer that was cut out of me. I'm dealing with that. I'm doing lots of research on it. So I research a lot about cancer, and I discovered that the Chinese Yellow Emperor that threw the Mongols out and established traditional Chinese medicine ran a 200-year cancer study with condemned prisoners. And they came to all kinds of conclusions that are being replicated by our guys today. So the conclusions about the nature of cancer that the Chinese Yellow Emperor discovered way back, 1,000 years ago, and the current medicos are of the same nature. And that is that cancer is not a disease. It's not triggered by bacteria. It's not viruses, any of this sort of thing. Cancer is instead a combination of a trigger of some form and a genetic expression that supports it. And that you can have 50 or 60 genes, out of which any 12 would cause you to have a cancer. If in a particular, and depending on which genes out of that 50, it would suggest you would have different cancers.
So everyone would have different cancer, at least potentialities in their genetics that are waiting for a trigger. Is that
correct? Correct. And they're waiting for the epigenetic support to keep those genes turned on while that trigger has a chance to mature into a cancer, so to speak. Well, here is, 5G is used to do epigenetic triggering on any number of species in part of the CRISPR. You're familiar with CRISPR, the gene splicer?
Right,
it's
gene editing. Yeah,
it's a terrible, terrible thing because people think it's slicing a particular gene. And the way that CRISPR works as a software, it's like, oh my God, people, don't you understand that if you're aiming at this gene, you might get 50 other splices that you're totally unaware of, 49 of them. And you're not even, the software is not even going to record that it did this.
That's the thing. Like they promote this as this is a way you're going to be able to extend your lifespan. You'll be healthier. You'll have designer babies. And we're moving into this transhumanist utopia. There's people who are saying we're going to get rid of the prison of our organic bodies.
Yeah, right.
Like you are truly insane if you're going to believe that. But what they don't always talk about, and I've been learning a little bit about this, like this science is not exact. Like it's more like using a hacksaw than a precise, right? So who knows what these effects are going to be with all of this gene editing that is, and plus black market gene editing. It's just like,
oh yeah,
this is going to be off the charts. Like we're moving into a crazy area, and with all kinds of mutations down the road, they're all going to be happening.
And so, okay, and we also have, let's get back to the idea of the space aliens here, right?
Yeah.
So you have the space aliens that are conducting a breeding program for a goal that we can't determine. But maybe our military is aware of this. Maybe our military is in fact tracking all of these people and doing everything they can to track them because they dare not interfere, because they don't necessarily want the powers that be on the other side to be aware that they're aware. And they certainly wouldn't want to betray how much they're aware of. And so there's all of these considerations because it's all motivated out of fear because we know so little about the opposition, so to speak. We just know that we're being invaded. And so they're going to try these wild ass things like 5G and so on. Now, there are things you can do as an individual, right? And we should not leave this subject without reassuring people that, yes, I believe that cancer is in virtually every single human in their future from this point forward. Okay, simply because the triggers that are providing us the epigenetic support for that are in our environment constantly in the form of even just Wi-Fi and cell towers and the electromagnetic radiations that we're in, this giant stew. And it's not going to get more simple, it's going to get more complex, and there's going to be more energies.
All right, so what can we do? What are some of the easy things?
Okay, so here's some of the easy things to do. There's 3 classes of chemicals that science is investigating now as anti-cancer drugs and as cancer preventatives. These 3 classes of chemicals are polysaccharides, triterpenes, and beta-glucans, okay, all of which are basically a form of sugar. The polysaccharide means many sugars and they're complex. The beta-glucans is much more complex, and the triterpenes is sugar taken to the point where it's almost an oil. All of the anti-cancer efforts now underway on the planet, with the exception of 1 different class of substances, are involved with those 3. Now, I know a way that you can get these things into you in a safe form for the rest of your life, and you'll get all kinds of benefits from them, and they may prevent cancer as well. But also the other benefits should not be swept aside because they're very much better. And here's the way you get these. There's basically 1,200. There's a spread of 1,200 of these chemicals. All combined, polysaccharides and the beta-glucans, et cetera, right? Triterpenes. Mm-hmm. These are found in medicinal mushrooms. Now, not all medicinal mushrooms have all of those 1,200. So, for instance, reishi mushroom is known as the master healer. It's got 450 blend of polysaccharides, triterpenes, and beta-glucans. Turkey tail, one of the most studied medicinal mushrooms, has got another 400. They overlap somewhat, but not totally. Same thing is true with lion's mane. If you want to protect your brain, by the way, get lion's mane in you every day, but make sure you're taking lion's mane in all of these, by the way, all of them, you must take them from either the fruiting body itself or an extract from a fruiting body, not mycelium. If you see on the label of a product that they're going to have reishi mushroom and it says mycelium, you're not getting the fruiting body, so you're not going to get those 450 chemicals. You're going to get the mycelium's version of those chemicals, which might be 220. So you're going to be missing a bunch of them. Anyway, so there's basically lion's mane, turkey tail, reishi mushroom, and chaga mushroom. If you were to ingest those 4 over the course of, daily doses over the course of a year or whatever, you're going to get those 1,200 chemicals that include among them the only chemicals that were being studied now by our science as being anti-cancer, either as cancer killers or as cancer preventers.
I believe I saw this on your website, Half Past Human, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. You had a little bit. And so how do people get these mushrooms? How is it? Do you just order them on Amazon or some other way?
Exactly. I'd say it's real simple these days. Go to Amazon, look for something that's organic and that contains stuff from the fruiting bodies. I don't get particularly all hung up on whether it's, greater than 30% beta glucans. There'll be various different kinds of sales techniques that the manufacturers will use. But at this moment, we're developing a very huge entree all around the globe into medicinal mushrooms, which is just great. So we've got people that are growing reishi mushrooms and turkey tail and lion's mane, etc., and putting them out into the population. Lion's mane is very interesting because it has a very unique characteristic. Of all of the mushrooms, it's the only one that has the ability to restore myelin to your nerves. Okay, so there's a big difference between, reptiles have a little tiny vagus nervous system that is totally useless. It provides nothing in the way of hormonal transfers to speak of. And a reptile will always react to what's going on in its environment and not react necessarily to what's going on internally. The environment will always overrule it. It is thought that this is true because their vagus nervous system has no fat lining around the nerves. It's unmyelinated. Okay, and so what's that disease? MS. MS is a disease in humans where the myelin is stripped off around the nerves, and so they don't function. Turkey or lion's mane takes the necessary fats from your body and reconstructs those. It builds new sheaths around all of your nerves, as well as providing nootropic support and new neural pathways and all these various different things for your brain.
Wow. So, is there evidence that MS would be ameliorated or lessened by lion's mane as a mushroom?
That was the traditional treatment in Chinese medicine. The best combination on the planet now is stem cells plus lion's mane. Okay. And if you go to any of the stem cell treatment for MS in the southern part of India, you will automatically be given concentrated lion's mane as part of the treatment.
Well, that's interesting.
So they know, right? Just like if you go for cancer treatment in Sweden, Norway, northern Germany, any of these areas up there, you'll also be getting extracts of reishi and or turkey tail as part of your chemotherapy, just because they know the benefit of it. Here in the United States, no. I get the cancer diagnosis, they cut the big cancer out of me, and the guy says, go away, I'll check your blood every 3 months. And so I'm sitting there thinking about it as I'm trying to recover. I've just been wasted by the experience. And over the next 3 months, it dawns on me, well, wait a second, that's a really stupid way to approach this. Because obviously I've got cancer cells in my body. I should be doing something right now that we've got it sort of on the run to finish it off. And that's why I got into the medicinal mushrooms and other herbal approaches, because there's other herbs.
Fascinating. You have to live a long time, Cliff. You're so deep. You're just such a gift. I just love hearing you talk. By the way,
take more drugs.
Well, I like to juice carrots, so I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah. With the beta carotene, I've always heard that's like a good anti-cancer type of thing. So I like to do juicing. I've done it for 20 plus years. I fell off of it, and I'm going back into it again. And I really enjoy it.
Get yourself some raw reishi powder or whatever and just put it in your smoothies.
I'll do that. I'll do it. I'm going to make a point of it. Look, how about we wrap this up here now? I think we've gone long enough so that the people on YouTube aren't going to get too mad at me. And so I really, Cliff, I want to thank you so much and encourage people.
That's not a problem. Not a problem.
It's been a pleasure for me. I would encourage people to go to your website, Half Past Human. I was there. There's a lot of really interesting pieces of writing that you have there. And B, there's links to a lot of your YouTube videos, which are quite fascinating indeed. So that's enough to keep people busy into the very, very broad range of interests that you have. I just really think, and I would like to do this with you again. I hope that's
sure.
okay.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
My pleasure. Well, look, let me wrap it up here. So this will conclude my interview with Clif High for the Richard Dolan Show. Cliff, I want to thank you for being on here. I want to thank all of the listeners and viewers who are here with us now, to be who have been with us. And Cliff, I hope to have you stick around. We're going to do another follow-up interview. We're going to go into some other topics. I'd like to ask you actually a little bit about what got you into the your like why linguistic prediction, like how that happened. You talked a little bit about it, but I really would like to dig in a little bit more and just chat with you maybe a little more freely. But for that, for now, I just want to thank you. And I just want to remind everyone, while we're learning and growing and doing all the things that we do, let's be good to each other. Thanks. Later.